Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. This is the third session of the Baal Shem Tov, A Life of Ecstasy, with Rabbi Ariel Evan Mayse. Just a reminder, when you're not actively speaking, if you can keep yourself muted, and then when you want to speak, you can feel free to unmute, just so we don't have background noise in class. You can also participate on the chat here on Zoom or as a comment if you're watching us live on Facebook. Hello to you as well. And I think with that, I'll just turn it to you, Rabbi Mays. Sorry.
I'm honored. It's wonderful to be here. So just to recap, um, we have been exploring the life story and the core teachings of the Baal Shem Tov over the past two sessions. Our first session focused on the notion of the Baal Shem Tov as someone who was in many respects a religious figure who came of age or spiritual awakening in the forest. Pursuant to that, there's a book I'd commend to all of you by Robert Harrison called Forests, The Shadow of Civilization. And it's about the relationship of human civilizations to forests. Um, One might also argue that there are civilizations within forests, and that's one of the things that he tries to show is that the attempt of Western civilization in some respects to try and pull itself out of the forest is part of our origin story and in a certain sense part of the primal sin that Western civilization has against the world that has given birth to it. One of the things that Harrison notes in this book is that the forest is a place of inversion. A forest is a place in which that which you thought you understood, you don't. Or that which you thought you grasped, you don't. That which you thought was strange becomes familiar, and that which you thought was familiar becomes strange. Thieves become righteous, and the righteous become thieves. This sort of thing, right? So we know this from Robin of Locksley. We know this from the Brothers Grimm. And something quite similar happens in the story of the Baal Shem Tov. Remember when we talked about his journey to the land of Israel in our previous session, we noted that he was wandering through the forest once and met a bunch of robbers who told them that they could tell him how to get to Israel, how to get to the land of Israel. The robbers become heavenly guides. These people who exist on the liminal parts of civilization are his fellow travelers. So this is all to say that so this is Robert Pogues Harrison's book. It's called um, Forests: the Shadow of Civilization, or The Shadows of Civilization. It's a very, very good book. He also has another book called Gardens, about thinking with gardens as another fulcrum of human being in the world. He's a beautiful writer. Um, when the Basht comes of age in the forest, sneaking off from the Beit Midrash to go hang out amongst the trees, that's where my sense he has this awakening to Melo Chol Haaretz Kvodo, to the fact that the world shimmers with a kind of divinity. Um, did we talk about the term shimmer last time? No? Oh, okay. So here's another piece I'll commend to everyone. Deborah Bird Rose, who is an anthropologist, has written an extraordinary Aliyah Shalom. She unfortunately passed away not long ago. She wrote a book called Shimmer, which is an ethnography of people and flying foxes, um, a kind of really cool frugivorous bat. And she thinks with the Yolngu Aboriginal people of Northern Australia, who have this concept called biryun, which means shimmer or incandescence or illumination. And for them, it means two things. One, it means that quality that art takes on when it goes live, that moment when it's no longer just a drawing, but it has become something, or when a written work shifts from being just random words on a page to something more than that. And so too, the physical world, Biryun, is the quality of the physical world, of the natural world, that invites participants into a vibrant and vibrating world. It's the world that is filled with a kind of power or divinity or potency or spiritual illumination. This is what she describes as shimmering. And that's what the Baal Shem Tov finds in the forest. That's what the Baal Shem Tov finds in the forest. And that's the message that he brings back from the forest to the Beit Midrash. In our second session, we talked about the Baal Shem Tov as someone who is, well, if not a kind of Don Quixote figure in the satiric sense, he is someone who well understood the fact that not every significant quest has an answer. These are not questions. A quest is something that we set out upon in order to seek, but not necessarily to find. So last time we looked at two sources about what happened on the Baal Shem Tov's ill-fated or perhaps well-fated trip to the land of Israel. He didn't get there. His ship broke. He may have ended up on an island with pirates. He may have ended up in captivity. He describes himself as being overcome by both despondency and sadness, as well as a kind of, I guess the word I would look for is bewilderment, where he doesn't remember any of his spiritual teachings. And what does he come up with? The letters. Because the letters can hold it all, like the trees can hold it all. The letters allow him to say Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled, Hey, Vav, and with them he is mitdabek ba'otiyot. This is going to take on even more significance next week when we talk about entering into the words of prayer and the kind of sonic theology of the Besht. How prayer itself becomes divinity. That's what happens on the road. We also talked about the Socratic notion that he has inherited not from Socrates directly or from Plato directly, but by way of the Arabic philosophers who translated into Hebrew. And there's this phrase that's often used amongst classical Jewish literature, Tachlit heyadiah de lo neda. The ultimate aim of knowing is not knowing, which meant one thing for Socrates, it meant another thing for Maimonides and for the Besht. He looks at this and says, exactly, except not all knowing, or not all unknowing is the same. And there are those who seek to know, and then they stop once they realize it can't be the aim can't be reached, and they kind of ignore everything after that. They close the book. And then there are those who sit with it, who stay with it, who search, and in the search experience a kind of awakening, which may not be a total revelation, but that's okay. Ours is a world in which the quest itself, the process itself, is rife with meaning. And in fact, that's where the revelation happens. And one of the sources that I gave you to look at your own time from one of the disciples of the Besht has this beautiful formulation from the Slichot liturgy of Himatse lanu bevakashatenu, which means probably something to the effect of make known to us or make present to us the object of our request, but it doesn't quite translate to that. Himatse lanu bevakashatenu means, quite literally, as the Besht translates it, become known to us in the quest. Himatse lanu bevakashatenu, in the bakasha, in the request or in the quest, become known to us. And that's the great lesson of prayer, of course, is that it is about the illumination that comes from the quest. That I think fully coheres with the notion that we looked at on session one about God's hiddenness is not a bug, it's a feature of the world. But God's double hiddenness, when we forget that God is hidden, that's when we really get lost. Okay, let me pause here. Questions, comments, things that we're reviewing before we get into the sources for today. Please. Yeah.
So I think I get that the Besht was not a Kabbalist, traditionally a scholar studying Zohar per se,
Right.
but him saying exactly sounds an awful lot like a lot of stuff in Zohar.
Yeah.
Precisely, I'm just curious, is there some indication that may have been a relationship, or it was from there?
So The Baal Shem Tov is actually called a Kabbalist in early sources. He's a Mikubal, which means everything from a faith healer to a Lurianic Kabbalist. It can mean everything in that. And so that like the moniker doesn't help us. There were um, I would say conflicting reports, even from the very early period, about how much he actually knew. We know a little bit about what people wanted him to know or think he knew from the accusation of the Mitnagdim, who say all they do is study Lurianic Kabbalah all the time, and that they don't even understand. But I think that's kind of off the mark for the best. So on the one hand, he he uses Lurianic sources, and we have a prayer book from someone who was close to him that uses Lurianic kavanot. Pretty technical stuff. Was he aware of that? For sure. But you couldn't. Let's go back to our forest metaphor. You couldn't shake a stick in Eastern European Jewish spiritual life without encountering Lurianic terminology. And in the decades after he dies, in the 1770s and the 1780s, this is the great flowering of the printing of Lurianic Kabbalah. For the first time, many of the core texts are finally being made available. The Besh dies in 1760, but he definitely knows about many of these things. The Zohar is a book he clearly loved. And there's a source from his grandson who says, when you read Zohar, you don't have to understand everything. It's like a fragrant, it's like incense is the word. It's like a fragrant, it's almost like aromatherapy. You enter, what I think they mean is you enter into the mythic world of the Zohar. And one way of reading that is, well, let's figure out what this symbol means and what this symbol means and what this symbol means, which is okay, fine. But there's another way of entering into the Zohar, which I think coheres with what you're saying, which is that it's about the quest and about the unfolding of the divine and the imagination. And one passage that I've never seen the best quote, but I imagine he must have like kept under his pillow at night, is that passage from um, the first volume of the Zohar, where the Zohar says, how do you know God? Noda b'sha'arim ba'ala. How can God be known in the gates? And they go back and forth. And one answer is the she'arim are the gates of the sfirot. And so we know God through the matrix of the sfirot. But the other answer that's given there is Rabbi Yehuda, who says, Noda b'sha'arim is she'ure de liba, the gateways of the imagination, the gateways of the heart. And l'sha'er in medieval Hebrew means both to measure and to estimate or to imagine in that sense. So, you know, the gateways of human imagination, of the religious imagination, are the gateway to God. This is um, totally the ethos of the best. In the end, the Zohar establishes that God can only be known in the imagination and not in the physical world, or not through the Sphirot, because the Zohar wants its cake and eats it too, in the sense that Rabbi Shimon says, no, 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 guys, you can only do it through the matrix of the Sphirot. We have this official doctrine. Rabbi Yehuda has a different answer, and I think in a certain sense, both of those reverberate within the teachings of the Zohar. Um, so this is something, and there's even a later interpretation of that, which says that this quest, which is also the quest of the Song of Songs, is what drives forward the world. And then you get this interesting text in the 16th century where they're like, yeah, this is why planets revolve. This is why we have orbits, and this is why planets revolve on an axis. Because like the revolving lovers in the Song of Songs who never find each other, the planetary motion um, follows that. And the perpetual motion is not like God's perfection as it is for the medievals and like Maimonides, but the perpetual motion is the never ending quest of everything to know God. So this is something that I think the Baal Shem Tov is reared in. And he takes from here and he takes from there and he takes from that and he brings it together in a kind of syncretic way. And his mystical library is not filled with the most technical of materials, but it's everything from that to the magical languages of the angels from Sefer Raziel Hamalach, which is published in 1701, to random other books of Eastern European pietism, to the stuff that he gets from the babis and babushkas in the forest. Like we know that there are um, interesting cross-cultural lines where people are trading remedies and showing different modes of thinking and interacting with the physical world, again in the forest, because it can happen there if it can't happen in the marketplace. Okay,
Rabbi Mayse, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to make sure that you see that Elio is.
yes, 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 please. I'm so
Okay.
sorry to have gone on and on. Elio, please.
No, 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 it's fine.
Hi, please. Why we have so little tales, so little histories about the best journey to Israel? We
Mhm,
have a lot of Nachman, of
mhm.
others, Rabbi going to Israel, Rabbi of Wittenberg, you have a lot, but why so little about the best?
It's a really great question. We have a bunch of stories, but they're all late, and they all post date sort of like the early period. They're all, let's say, versions of it in the Shivchei Abesht 1815, 1814, like right around then. And then there are other versions. Actually, a dear friend of mine who also unfortunately passed away not long ago, Tzipi Kaufman, wrote a beautiful essay. I think it's only in Hebrew, trying to track the different versions of this story. And turns out, like with most things, there's, as we said, there's Maimonides, there's Maimonides. The versions of this story actually reflect how everyone wants to retell it in each and every generation. But they really start in the around the age, the time of 1814, 1815. Except those stories in the writings of the Besht, or the teachings of the Besht himself, where he says, "Remember when I was on that journey." So part of it, I think, is we don't actually have that much biographical information. What Rabbi Nachman had that we don't have is a scribe. Rabbi Nachman has Rav Nosson, who records the sacred history of Rabbi Nachman's life. And we know that the Baal Shem Tov has a scribe who writes out his amulets for him. We know that he has a family, but we don't have any clear sense that the family is committed to telling these tales. So I guess there are a couple of answers. One is that it's symptomatic of a greater lack of information, except when you like poke through and begin to look at the text more carefully. A second is that this journey may have been well known to those early people, and the stories that are written down or the teachings that are written down are not that, because precisely because it was already known to them and they had no need to think about recording it for posterity. A third reason is that we don't know how much of the story is fact and how much is fiction. And it certainly could be the case that it became more and more important as time went on. And a fourth reason could be that um, the Baal Shem Tov occasionally talks about himself in the first period, the first person. Oftentimes, though, he speaks the language of myth. And it's there where he has a tale actually in the back of Toldot Yaakov Yosef about what happens when Shekhinah is sent into exile and her boat breaks and she's accosted by these demonic forces. And it's a very strange, sort of problematic, uncomfortable story about loss and devastation and journeying and eventually finding God. But it feels like an early draft of Rabbi Nachman's The Story of the Lost Princess. In fact, that's really what it is. It's an earlier version of what Rabbi Nachman will tell there. And that too could be a story about the Besht's own journey and exile and loss, which is far less jejun than the versions that we find later on. But only sometimes do Jewish mystics ever speak in the first person. This is one of the things that Gershom Scholem points out in his introduction to major trends in Jewish mysticism in the 1940s, is that unlike certain Christian and Catholic mystics who are quite reticent, not at all reticent to speak in the first person, or even many Islamic Sufi mystics, Jewish mystics by and large don't talk about their experiences. They tell about them through the language of hermeneutics and through interpretation. So it's either one of those answers or a different one.
Thank you.
That's a great question. Other remarks, questions, thoughts, probings, lurchings, wonderings? otherwise we can get started on the sources for the third session or the third set of sources.
I want to make sure just that you saw the what Eugene wrote in the chat.
Yeah. Eugene,
Okay,
do you want to come off mute and just say one more word about that?
oh, sorry, go ahead.
So it was, well, I think we kind of passed the moment, but it was about the passage from the Zohar you were referring to, in which, which is really about Sarah and Isaac at the, in front of the tent, right? And from there, the Zohar develops this idea, and to see, what to think about, what it means to be at the gates. And he goes to the stages that you're talking about, but in the end, it says, he's beyond, right? Higher and higher, he uses, this kind of rhetoric of repetition.
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, he talks about what you just said, that we can find him in imagination.
Yeah. And ultimately, I think that is the answer of the Zohar, which is that the Sefirot become one way of getting there. But we talked about in the first session about the fact that for Maimonides, he has this deep and unceasing desire to cleanse religious thinking of the imagination, whereas the Zohar goes in the opposite direction. And rather than saying, I'm going to give you one image, I'm going to give you 1,000 images, I'm going to give you 1,000 different ways of thinking about God as a bird, God as a stone, God as a mountain, God as light, God as water, God as water light, all of these things. And I think that's the answer. You're right. That's the answer that the Zohar certainly leans into. And that's one of the things that makes it such a delightful text, and one of the things that makes it such a spiritually fertile text for all sorts of religious types. It's interesting that it's a source that can be read by artists, dancers, experiential mystics, and sort of really hard-boiled technical Kabbalists, and everyone thinks that it's a great source. Okay, good. Fantastic. So let's open the sources for session 3. And here I think we're going to meet one of the next core teachings of the Besht. And a number of scholars have pointed out that this may actually be a kind of axial shift in the Besht's thinking in the wake of this trip to the land of Israel. Maybe it's a result of what happens on the trip. Maybe it's a result of new ideas that he encounters in Istanbul. Maybe it's a result of his own maturation. Maybe it's a result of the fact that for the next 20 years, the trip happens, if it happens, in between 1735 and 1740 at some point in there. Between 1740 and 1760, we know that the Baal Shem Tov lives in a town called Mezhbizh, which is not just a tiny nothing town. I forgot to ask, has anyone ever been to Mezhbizh? So it's a beautiful city with a giant castle and a beautiful market. And I've been to small towns in Ukraine. Actually, the Maggid of Mezrich is buried in a tiny town, which looks like not that different than I can imagine it looked 200 years ago. The road into the town and the road out of the town, there's no pavement anywhere, not to mention stoplights or things like that. Mezhbizh is not that. Mezhbizh is a much bigger city, and I think that that's actually important for understanding the Besht, not as a cosmopolitan figure living in Berlin, but as a figure who's living in a town with a giant castle and a giant market. This is not someone who's living in nowhere shtetl, USA. So as a result of that, as a result of the journey, as a result of the new ideas, we don't know, one of the things that the Besht sheds is a commitment to ascetic piety. The stories about the Besht's early life are about fasting and about withdrawal, not from physicality, but withdrawal from human society. That changes in his 30s, in the 30s, and at a certain point, the Besht becomes a socially adept mystical thinker. We'll talk a lot about that in our 5th session. And also someone for whom the physical world is not only shimmering with divinity, but filled with a divinity that can be accessed through human action in such a way that we would do well to ignore the ascetic impulse and to look to transform our actions in the world rather than avoid any kind of physicality. By this he means, of course, the mitzvot and all sorts of other kinds of rituals, but that's the least of this. What he means is that every kind of physical action, whether it's that famous Hasidic story about serving God through painting one's wagon wheel, or all of the others about eating and drinking and dance as modes of worship, this is where that idea begins. Okay, so far so good? Good. So 1740s is like the hotbed of the beginning of that mode of thinking. So we have in this teaching, right there at the very beginning of the page in the session 3, the Mezhbizh years, from Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya, our friend and fellow traveler, I heard the following interpretation of this verse in my teacher, the Besht's name. Everyone see it there? Okay. Steve, do you
Not
have
on the screen. Is that what you're saying?
No, do you have it on your sources? Yeah, okay. Everyone see it wherever. Do I need to? I'm happy to share my screen, but then I can't see all of you wonderful people. So
I made it so you can if you want to. It's up to you.
I don't know. It's so nice to be learning in a community.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's okay then.
Okay, good. Can I ask someone to read? Actually, this is one that I want to track inside. I heard the following interpretation of this verse in my teacher, the Besht's name.
I'll read.
Please.
Yeah. I heard the following interpretation of this verse in my teacher's name, the best name. All that your hand can do it with your power. In the netherworld, there is neither awareness nor account. Enoch, who was to become the chief angel, Metatron, was a cobbler. With each stitch that he sewed, the Blessed Holy One is unified.
Okay.
The matter is thus.
Hold on there. Good. Thank you so much. So what do we notice from this? First of all, Shamati, I heard. In my teacher's name, Beshem. I heard it. Did I hear it from him? Well, I heard it from someone else who told it in the teacher's name. This text will be quoted something, I counted it once. I think it's 22 times in the writings of Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya, sometimes in the name of the Besht, sometimes as something he heard directly from the Besht, and sometimes from other people. Or just like Shamati she'omrim, I hear that they are out there saying. Now, I think what that tells you is two things. One, this may have been something that the Besht often said, but I actually don't think so. I think this was something that the Besht said that took Rabbi Yaakov Yosef by force. He like overwhelmed him. And have you ever had this thing where you read a book and then no matter what conversation you're in, you're like, oh yeah, it's related to that book that I'm reading, and I'm going to tell you all about that book. That's just like this great book, or a Devar Torah that I heard in shul, and like no matter what the parsha is, I'm going to talk about that. I get the sense that it's kind of like that this was something that rocked Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya's world in such a way that he really, really, really liked it, or he found it really challenging. Okay, so what is the Besht working with? What verse has he chosen as the point of departure for this teaching? A verse from Ecclesiastes. Kol asher timsai b'yadcha la'asot b'kochacha aseh ki ein b'she'ol dat v'cheshbon, which isn't exactly the verse, but it's close enough for our purposes. What does that verse mean? If I woke you up in the middle of the night and I asked you, what is Kohelet? What does Ecclesiastes want us to understand from this verse? Yeah, Brian.
Just to check, can you hear me now? Is my audio? It's okay. Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks. We were having problems earlier. Thank you. Yeah, I guess what immediately springs to mind is a sense that this physical reality is the only one we have.
Yeah.
Make the most of it, embrace it, use it to its ultimate degree.
Mm-hmm.
That after this, one has not that possibility. Is that it? Rough idea.
Meaning before there were the new materialists, there were the Marxian materialists, and before there were the Marxian materialists, there were the like ancient materialists, of which, Epicurus is one, and maybe the pre-Socratic philosophers had their own versions of this, and the post-Socratic philosophers had that. Materialism is not a new way of thinking, and I don't just mean like consumerism. I mean materialism in the sense of the belief that, Brian, just as you said, that the material world, this world, is what it is, and there isn't another. And so this world is the one where all the action happens, because if we go, we're going to hell, and it doesn't really matter. Now, there's a strangeness of this verse in the Hebrew Bible, although it kind of coheres with elements of the Hebrew Bible, especially in the fact that there's no afterlife, at least not one that is clearly explained in the Hebrew Bible, and that becomes a flashpoint of controversy in between two different ancient Jewish sects, one of whom becomes more or less extinct, and one of whom becomes Rabbinic Judaism, who is committed to the belief in the afterlife. But Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, is a book that I think we all struggle with. We all struggle to make meaning from it, and we struggle with the religious ethos. And the beginning and the end of that book seem to be appended at a later date, because the readers of that book were equally uncomfortable with it in the ancient world. So the verse seems to here command us to do whatever we can with vim and with vigor, because there is no accounting or no awareness of what happens. Okay, fine. Hold on to that. The Besht is the one who links this to this next myth or this next story. They're generally not related. He then quotes a story about Enoch. Before this text, what do we know about Enoch? Chanoch. Chanoch is a elliptical star of the Hebrew Bible. He gets not 10 minutes of fame, but 2 verses of fame, more or less, in the book of Genesis. And we know 2 things about him. He walks with God, and then he isn't. The eneno. And then he just ceases to be. And, there's like a sort of ancient impulse in rabbinic sources and in the Midrash that the less is written about someone in the Hebrew Bible, the more midrash that person is going to get. And the same is true of Hanoch, but it actually starts before the classical midrash. There are books of Enoch. There's Enoch 1, there's Enoch 2, there's Enoch 3, there's Enoch 4, and these are in a range of different languages from around the ancient Near East. So we have it in Coptic, we have it in versions in Hebrew, we have it in Greek. And Enoch becomes this kind of celestial all-star who travels up into the heavens and sees everything in God's world, and even becomes a kind of either angelic or almost deified figure. And each one has its own version, but in the Enoch stories, he is constantly ascending into the heavens. And this eventually gives rise, to what will become the Hechalot literature of going up into the heavens to look for the divine. Enoch, together with Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yisra'el, become very, very important figures in that. Just hold on to that for one more week, because we're going to talk about that and its relationship to the Besht next week, because the Besht is also a Hechalot figure. But here, what do we find out? He's the angel Metatron. He becomes a kind of semi-divine figure. Not our issue for now. Metatron is this really interesting figure in Jewish history, who no one knows that much about, but he's someone who kind of dances on the line in between divine and angelic. Chanoch becomes this kind of person, right? The other midrashic rule is that, what did one of my teachers once call it? The law of conservation of characters. If you can combine characters, then you do, right? Like Eliyahu and Pinchas become the same person, and so Metatron and Chanoch become the same person. Yeah? And what's his big claim to fame? What's his amazing spiritual skill? Tom? What's his skill?
He's a shoemaker.
He's a shoemaker. He's a shoemaker. He's a cobbler. He's a sandlar. And what does he do? He is me'ached kudsha brichu ushchein te with every tefirah. So there are many different versions of that. Here you have the formulation is be'et asiyat hama'aseh. Another version of it is bechol tefirah utefirah haya me'ached kudsha brichu ushchein te, or me'ached shamayim va'aretz. All different versions of this appear in the writings of the Toldos. Okay. Can someone explain to me why it's such a big deal to be a cobbler, to be a shoemaker? Yeah, Brian.
Again, the manual, the physical, is actually
Yeah.
the root to this extraordinary achievement of unifying the Sfirat, I suppose, is what is meant here. That this is not through some abstraction, but through a very mundane physical act.
Yeah. So first of all, the physical action, and it's a beautiful one because, you stitch things together and obviously this isn't what he means, but there's a kind of soulfulness of this action of bringing together the dimensions. And like if you've ever made a shoe, you really have this. You have something on top, you have something on the bottom, and you have to link them together, and it goes up and up and up and up, up and down, up and down. And it's a really interesting experience. But Brian, you said a word that I want to okay, so Sfirot, yes, it's also it's the Holy One and Shekhinah, the masculine and the feminine dimensions of the divine that are being linked together, and they're woven together through this action. We'll see that there are many other dyads that are also being brought together, many different sort of dualities. But you said again, Brian, and I think that's true. I think we're starting to see that there is a difference between the classical way of interpreting the verse and the way that the Besht is going to interpret it. It's not exactly against the grain, but it is going to be almost counterintuitive in that way, because what Kohelet might be pointing us toward here is a world in which we are bewildered and it's a lack of meaning, and there's like no sense and no accounting, and so might as well really enjoy it. Have another cup of wine, do this, do that. Here you have the sense of someone who has transformed what we would call the most mundane of actions, right? He's like taken the thing that we're all literally trotting upon and turning it into a spiritual activity. The Besht is not the one who invents this myth, by the way. Hanoch is a sandlar, as a shoemaker. It goes back to the 12th or 13th century, if not a little bit before. And there's an interesting version of it that also like appears in Sufi sources, which is something I haven't fully thought through or pursued, but it's a shared myth that you find between Jews and Muslims. So, yeah, Steve, come on.
It's almost like he's taking the kavanah that you find, or kavanot that you find in so many Hasidic prayer books, and expanding it to everything you do instead of just for certain mitzvot.
Exactly. So that's exactly the move that's happening here. And two other data points that I think are really important. One is there's a passage in the work Shnei Luchot HaBrit, which is Shnei Luchot HaBrit is a great book. It's a great book to read, and it's a great book in the sense that it has an enormous influence on Jewish thought, on Jewish piety in Eastern Europe, on Jewish piety to a lesser degree in Central Europe, although also, and it's a great work in that it's enormous. It's many, many volumes, and it's, unlike some authors who kvetch over every word, the Shnei Luchot HaBrit is someone who didn't self-censor, and he just like, by Isaiah Horowitz, he writes and he writes and he writes and he writes and he thinks things through, and his writing is crystal clear, but it's a long book. So there's one passage that is buried in that book that I think is actually really interesting, where it says, so the author, Isaiah Horowitz, says, it's not enough in our lives to say L'Shem Yichud Kucha Brichu Ushchein Te, this formula, the exact formula, Steve, that you were just pointing us toward, for the sake of uniting God, the Blessed Holy One, and the Shekhinah, before doing the mitzvot. We have to do it also before Kol Ma'aseh U'Ma'aseh, each and every action in the world. And in doing so, every action becomes a Melechet HaKodesh. It becomes sacred work. And that's a passage, again, the Besht doesn't quote it, but I don't think the Besht had to quote it in order to have seen it. And even if he didn't see it, it's hard to know what's passed around orally in the short version of the Shla the Kitzur which is also passed around in Eastern Europe and they really love. So it's hard to know. And if it, if he didn't see it, he could have seen it. And if he didn't, if it didn't actually happen, I think it coheres with that ethos, which is a part of what happens in Eastern Europe, which is a kind of ritualization of ordinary life. This is the time in which there are more and more handbooks being written about more and more different things, and more different things become governed by what we would call Jewish law or Jewish ritual. Everything from deathbed confessions to eating manuals, these things existed earlier, but now there are more and more things written about it. This is that, it's a part of that, it's almost like a subspecies of that process, but it's also distinct. It's distinct in that this is not about the grammar or the choreography, but about the intention. So the word, Steve, that you used was the kavanah. And I think the distinction that's often drawn, that's I think a very helpful one, is the difference between kavanot and kavanah. Kavanot are those long formulae that are listed in Kabbalistic books. They're intricate, they're highly specific, and they're also highly specific for each and every action. What in Hasidism you find is a commitment to kavanah, which we would call intention or intentionality, or a kind of focus that happens through action. And this is the next point that I think is critical here. Be'et asiyat hama'aseh. When he's acting, when he's working, when he's doing, that's when he has this kind of revelatory moment. Dveikut in Hasidism happens through action. It doesn't happen in spite of action. Now, there's a passage in the Kuzari, which is then quoted by Nachmanides in the 13th century, where he says, "Uvo tidbak," and to cleave to God is when you're talking to other people, you're actually thinking about God, and you're not actually with the people, right? It's almost like what I had to do today, phoning it in, except in the worst kind of way. You're walking in the world almost as a kind of zombie, and what you find in Hasidism is that the exact opposite is the case, is that dveikut comes through not absence in action, but through presence in action. And so kavanah is, I guess I would translate it as intention, but it's intention that guides the flow of attention, focus, and affect as well. Is that through the mitzvot? For sure. But like the Besht is almost nothing about mitzvot. It's really interesting. He almost never uses that term, mitzvah. It's there, it's here, it's around a couple of times. There's a passage here on the page where he invokes it, schar mitzvah, mitzvah, which you'll see later. The reward for doing a mitzvah is not, as the classical rabbinic sources, the reward for doing a mitzvah is not doing another mitzvah, but the reward for doing a mitzvah is, according to the Besht, the mitzvah that you're doing. It's the action itself, right? Like what Thich Nhat Hanh says, I don't wash the dishes to have clean dishes. I wash the dishes to wash the dishes. I think about this a lot when I'm like sorting my kids' laundry. I don't do this so that like I can actually get past what we call Mount Saint laundry in our back hall. I do it because there's something really actually spiritually powerful about that action, which is both because of the specificity of that action and also because what happens when I attentively perform something. So I think that there's this really, I mean, you'll forgive me, I'm live streaming here, but I don't want to get too polemical. There's a really, I think, misguided debate about early Hasidism, about it being, it is antinomian, they didn't really like halacha, they did like halacha, they didn't believe in the mitzvot, they did believe in the mitzvot, and I think that totally misses the boat. Of course they believed in halacha because that's the thickness of ritual that they all lived in. They also believed in the mitzvot as technologies of connectivity, as rituals that allow for that. But what Hasidism does is makes the world of religious life so much bigger. So that for sure when you're praying, for sure Shabbat, for sure all of these other things that are the classical mitzvot, that's all included in this. And mitzvah comes from the word savta, tevet, connection or connectivity. And at the same time, it's not the only thing that brings that connectivity. Here, the words that I would say underline in every color that you have is be'et asiyat hama'aseh. When you are acting, when you are doing this kind of work, that's when God becomes present. That's when God becomes real. Tom.
Yeah, I just find it so interesting, the various words here, thought, action, the one that and how they are. I just feel so many nuances that I don't really know. I'd like to know more about the Hebrew of them, because in the first paragraph it says that it talks about awareness. In the netherworld, there's neither awareness,
Mm-hmm.
and so I just I'm noting, and there's so much emphasis now just in what you were saying through action, our actions, and I'm not disputing these things, but there's also this incredible power I feel that's awareness, and which you also mentioned, and that's all wrapped into kavanah. But the feeling that I have, in addition to whatever awareness is, paying attention, and that's so essential to so many different traditions and practices. But it's the feeling that awareness is transformational, that it's through awareness. I mean, actions, it's easy to see our impact because it's doing, but awareness is transformational too. And I just have, when Enoch is the cobbler, he's impacting the Blessed Holy One because of his awareness and his intention as he's doing, but something is transforming in that moment of awareness. I don't know.
You do know. You're barking up the right tree. I think that's exactly where the text goes. There's a teaching from one of the students of the Besht on the verse in the book of Numbers, Aselecha shte chatzotzrot, make for yourself 2 trumpets of silver. It's read in sort of like good Eastern European fashion. Chatzotzrot are read as chatzi tzuras, chatzi tzurot, make for yourself 2 forms. And one way that that's often deployed is the 2 forms are God and human beings, and they're co-creative. They're co-completative, right? God and human beings are like the 2 hands in Escher's drawing. We're both necessary, and human action gives God articulation, and divine potency comes forward in human attention and action. The other way that that's often deployed is that thought and action become those 2 forms. They're almost Janus-faced, and they're both necessary, and you need them both. Janus-faced not in the sense of an opposition, but Janus-faced in the sense of something that is interwoven one with the other. So that's not exactly the metaphor that I want. It's more like 2 sides of the same coin in the positive sense, in that you need action and you need thought and you need them together, and that the path of discovery involves them both. That's where the text is going to go. So he says the matter is thus: thought is called infinite, Ein Sof, machshava. Why is thought called Ein Sof? Yud He Vav He. I mean, I stop thinking all the time because I get tired. But I think his point is that, like, thought is endless. It's Mayim She'ein Lehem Sof. It's this endless expanse of inner possibility. At the same time, it's Yud He Vav He. It's the font of being. It's being itself. It's existence. It is this tremendous and unbounded domain. It's also unactualized. It's potential. Right? It's like when I sit down to write, and I have this moment where it's like the 3 Stooges, and they're trying to get through the doorway at the same time, and the paper remains blank, and it doesn't, like, the canvas doesn't become filled. Thought's wonderful, and thought's absolutely necessary. It's described in Hasidic sources as a kind of alphabet soup. It's the place from where ideas go to be born. And at the same time, it lacks feet. Let's use that metaphor. So action, which is Adonai, which is Shekhinah, which is Ma'aseh, is the next part of that dyad. And when you connect, and just listen to the language here, when you connect thought with action in the moment of action, that's what unifies the Blessed Holy One and Shekhinah. Ka'asher mechaber ha'ma'aseh im ha'machshava be'et asiyat ha'ma'aseh Nikra Yuchud Kudsha Bricho Shchente. So you can hear mechaber, chibur, connection. When you connect thought with action while you are acting in the world, that's the uniting of the Blessed Holy One and Shekhinah. So part of this is the fact that you have to think before you act. And part of this is that you have to act before you think. Or perhaps better, that those don't exist in a kind of timeline process, but there's a kind of simultaneity in the both of them. And anyone who's existed in the world of writing or teaching or art or most other kinds of action in the world knows that we as human beings actually learn through doing. There are kind of three schools of ritual studies. One of them is that ritual is always thoughtless and you never know what you're doing and it doesn't matter. And in fact, it's better to not know what you're doing. And that was what a lot of scholars used to think about ritual when they denigrated it and said it was like this primitive thing that like the worst religions all did, including Judaism. And then there was another, which was that ritual is all about the symbols. So if you've ever read the works of Clifford Geertz, he is all into the symbols. The lulav, for example, or the four species or whatever it is, point toward these kind of grand symbols. And do the people know? Well, they might not. But it's all about the symbolic universe that they exist in. And there's another school of ritual studies in the academy that's emerged over the last, let's say, 10 to 15 years, which I find very compelling, which is that rituals are modes of human beings making sense of the world, and they're modes of human beings thinking. So there's this great book called Thinking Through Ritual, like thinking through ritual, but also thinking by means of ritual, which goes through and tries to bring together the worlds of philosophy and ritual studies and show, like, have you ever had this moment where you're, I don't know, painting? I have a paintbrush in my hand. Writing, moving clay or something like that, and something else comes out that you didn't know you had in you? It's this moment in which human beings can actually process information and make sense of our world, not first, but actually through action. And I think this is very much what the Besht is pointing toward. So does that happen through the mitzvot? Again, Steve, to your point, for sure, absolutely, but it's not just them. That's one node on the landscape, or one node in the map of thinking about the effectiveness of action. Okay, so when you have presence in action, intention in action, whether that's eating and drinking, or whether that's speech, or whether that is dance, or whether that is painting a wagon wheel, or making a shoe, or any other number of human activities in this world, you are uniting the Blessed Holy One and Shekhinah. So how is he going to bring that back to the verse? Jewish sources always are wrapped up with hermeneutics, with interpretation. Hasidism is very midrashic in its formulation. It begins with a verse, and then in the ancient midrashic form, it begins with a verse and then immediately departs, and everyone is kind of like, well, how's that going to come back? And there's almost a kind of rhetorical anticipation. And so now he brings it back. This is what the verse says: Kol asher timsa yadcha la'asot bekochacha aseh, ritzono lomar ki hamachshava nikra chochma koach ma. Thought is called wisdom, the power of what, or the expansiveness of possibility. I think that's what it means. The force of all that is. Okay, so in performing an activity with your power, koach ma, with power, with action, or with the power of what can be, that is binding mind to action, lechaber shnehem, which is uniting the Blessed Holy One and Shekhinah. So now let's retranslate the verse according to what the Baal Shem Tov has showed. Kol asher timsa yadcha la'asot bekochacha aseh. Everything that you do with your hands, everything that comes into your purview to do, and everything that you do with your body. Bekochacha aseh. Do it not with a sense of vim and vigor or with a sense of enjoyment, because it's all going to fall apart in the next world, but do it with fullness of mind. Bekochacha aseh. Bring together fullness of mind, fullness of presence, fullness of that which we would call the interior domain, but anchor that in the action, because both of those things are necessary. So, rejecting that split that Descartes has in between mind and body, and rejecting in another way the ancient notion of a difference between the vita contemplativa and the vita activa, of an active life or a contemplative life. Both of those are necessary here. And that is binding them together like the two parts of a shoe, or like the two parts of the divine, stitching together the divine within and the divine without through the work of your hands. Now, ki ein b'she'ol dat v'cheshbon, because there's neither awareness nor account in the netherworld. The tevat ein, or ayin, mishamesh lamala ulamata. The word ein, or there is not, has a double meaning. It's a double entendre. Ritzei lamar, that is to say, shim eincha ma'amin bazeh v'tistapek bazeh. If you don't believe in this possibility, if you allow yourself to be cast into doubt, az, then, ein b'she'ol dat v'cheshbon. Then you've ended up in a world in which there is neither awareness nor account. So ein can mean the infinite possibility of human action. And it can also mean the abyss of meaninglessness. And how do you know when it's one or the other? Well, it's kind of up to you. What kind of world do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a world in which questioning and doubt is like the ancient Jewish way? I don't think that's what he means. I think what he means is that if you believe in a world in which you think that things are arbitrary, in which meaning can't be not only attributed to, but actually summoned forth through ordinary actions, then yeah, where do you live? Sheol, hell. You have no cheshbon, accounting, or awareness, and I think that's the next key word, da'at, which in the Hasidic lexicon, following on Kabbalistic lexicon, isn't just mind awareness, but it's that kind of mystical consciousness of the possibility of the spiritual as in the physical. And so the inverse of that is to live your life with da'at and with cheshbon. So with cheshbon doesn't mean accounting in a financial sense. It means it in a sense of carefully calibrating one's actions in the world. And da'at, it means taking those actions and filling them with a kind of open-heartedness and open-mindedness such that every action becomes a lightning rod or a funnel or an articulation or a translation of that life of the inner world into the domain of action. Is that true of the mitzvot? For sure. It's also true not only of the mitzvot ben adam lemakom, of our relationship with God, it's true of our relationship with other people. And he's very clear about this. This is equally true of all social, we would call like the social ethic. And it's also true that it happens when it's just me working on my art, just me writing, just me making shoes, whatever it might be. But the infinite possibility here is precisely that which is mapped out through human action. Okay, I want to pause for just a second. We're almost at time, so I want to open this up to reflections. You know, when Martin Buber reads Hasidism as a kind of Jewish existentialism, he's not wrong. This is about how you create a life of meaning when, you know, like, I feel like now, like what people used to say about Aristotle in the medieval world, they would say Aristotle had a lot of great theories. Aristotle, Yimach Shemo, may his name be blotted out. Now, you know, it's like, think about Heidegger and people like that. But like when Heidegger says you're thrown into the world that you didn't decide its circumstances, the Besht is in a certain sense also pushing that forward. We are not the ones who determine the circumstances of our being, but we are the ones who determine what we make of that. And when we talk about a Jewish version of, let's say, the hero's journey, and about how we turn fate into destiny, something that is beloved to Rabbi Soloveitchik, something that I know is something that Rabbi Silber has taught about. When we talk about turning fate into destiny, This is like the microcosm. It happens not only in the grand sweep of history, but also every time we pick up a coffee mug. Elio, please.
Please, sorry. I was talking about that, but this is kind, as best is not, for sure is not only best, but here the thought is not linked to the action, because all the time we say we can link Shekinah to God, but here Shekinah is linked to God.
Yeah.
I think it's a controversy here. Okay, you can say you have consciousness, you know that they is linked, but you don't feel it. But clearly God's linked to Shekinah all the time. All the time we say about the lost princess.
Yeah.
I think this is a myth about.
It's an interesting rethinking of that, because here, on the one hand, the unity is already there, but now it's being spelled out in a totally different way. But it's also a mode of grappling with the fracture of the world in each and every action. So it's like the Lost Princess playing out every time we act in this world. There's no moment where we're not contributing to this. And I think this is one of the other core messages of what the Besht will bring forward, which is what happens in the Beit Midrash is crucial. What happens in the moments of prayer is crucial. But, the image that the Besht, he doesn't use this image, but it's one I often come back to, which is like, how much does the tefillin leave an imprint upon you throughout the day? I think that's one of the questions that the Besht would ask. And I think the same thing is true here, which is that like your work is not done when you've done those things. Your work is only beginning, because they're emblematic rather than exhaustive. And so the 613 mitzvot, the Taryag mitzvot, become 613 different demonstrations of the infinite capacity of ordinary actions to bring together these, on the one hand, unified, and on the other hand, split asunder dimensions of our world, in the world of fracture, complexity, and multiplicity that we exist within. And on the third hand, it's not simply something that happens in the heavens. It's something that happens in our own lives. And this kind of what we would describe as a kind of spiritual illumination that we experience is that moment in which action and mind come together, or the work of our heart and the work of our hands come together. And in doing so, we know that we have contributed one more step forward in the unification of Kuchabrichu Ushchinte. Tomer, please.
Thank you, Rabbi Dr. Ariel. I wanted to mention also, since we were mentioning cobbler, that going to cobbler is also finding a missing part which we need for our shoes.
Yeah.
So those parts, we lost them, and they get repaired. He finds them for us. He finds them, and he repairs the shoes. That's also one of the things I think I would like to just mention. Thank you.
I've never thought about that. I love that. The cobbler is the person you commission your shoes from, but the cobbler is also the person that you bring them to when they're broken. All right, here. Now I've never thought about this, but like that's what the Besht is doing. He's a shoemaker, right? He's bringing together souls and actions. And in a certain sense, next time I'll show you the tax record that we have of the Besht, where you can see his name up in lights, or just like this tiny little thing, and him as a rabbi and healer and someone who's there, paid for by the community. But this is what he does, right? He takes the broken things and makes them, if not whole, he shows people how to work with things that are broken. Tomer, that's amazing. Thank you. Brian, please, we'll give you the last word, I think.
It's just following on from that. Wonderful observation. I'm just wondering, is there something here arising out of this understanding of the cobbler which takes us toward the idea of the tzaddik? Because the cobbler is somebody who has a very particular skill. And we go to this person, we seek this person out for the performance of that particular skill. Is there something emerging there that becomes the idea of the tzaddik, who has a sort of leadership role and a special skill, you could say?
Yeah, I mean, the cobbler's a good one to think with, because The cobbler has special skills. Also, in certain areas, cobblers are controlled by guilds, and you have to be an apprentice first before you can become a cobbler. So it's not just someone who can do like the shoe work, but also someone who is authorized to do the shoe work and can hang their sign up. And um, the Besht is a lot about spiritual teachers and spiritual pedagogy, and nothing about the tzaddik as a qualitatively different human being who stands at the helm of a community. You don't really find that in the teachings of the Maggid either, for whom the tzaddik is a what he calls a tzion, or a tziyun, a pointer to show you the way. It was like one of my teachers, Reb Zalman Schechter Shalom, we used to often say, it's actually also in Shai Agnon, he would say, everyone has a maze in between you and God, and the tzaddikim are the people who tell you where they found the dead ends. They're not unique people. They're people who are willing to be forthright about their own mistakes, shortcomings, and also their own spiritual journeys. And obviously that changes in the, like, let's say the 1790s, where you start to get dynastic structures, and then obviously into the 19th century, it really transforms. And there you see tzaddikim as everything, described as everything from midwives and like spiritual mothers to priests to prophets to lightning rods of spiritual conductivity that can be superconductors for spiritual experience. So does this open up that possibility? The answer, I think, is yes, for sure, because one of the things that you'll see in the 19th century sources is that doctrines like this get wrapped up and they get sewed up and put onto the tzaddik's desk only. They're in the tzaddik's portfolio. We can't do this, but the tzaddik can. We can't do this with food, but the tzaddik can do this through food, and then we can eat their kugel, right? We can eat their leftovers, which is an ancient Hasidic, or at least a long-standing Hasidic custom is to eat the leftovers from the teacher because they have that kind of holy residue. But in the first generations, I don't think you find that. I think what you find here is a sense that, Tomer's point is 100% well taken. Like, I think the Besht is a shoemaker, and the shoemaker is the person who teaches us to work with broken things. On the other hand, the other part of Tomer's point is really well taken, which is that, like, the Besht is teaching us to be shoemakers. There's nothing I read in this source where I'm like, oh, I can't do that. I mean, I can't make a shoe for sure, but like the point is that this is something that is not at all easy to master, but it's not something that's difficult to do.
Thank you. That's really
every action, and I think that's the imperative here is one that is open to all and unrestricted. And in fact, you might say it's even stronger than that. Otherwise, we're contributing to the entropy of the universe. Yeah. Eugene, you for sure have the last word because we have to get out before the next class comes in.
Sorry, so it just struck me, that, I mean, I come from Eastern Europe, and we had an old style shoemaker in our neighborhood.
Yeah.
He was in a little stiebel.
Yeah.
And you walked in, you're so small, you were with the back to the door. Yeah. But I remember, the main thing that I remember from him is how he glued and sewed things together, and I would watch him.
Yeah.
And when I was a kid, I wanted to be a shoemaker. I wanted to do this stuff, I did it with newspaper and stuff like this, but I just remember that, and maybe it has something to do with my love of the Besht.
Yeah.
That it just came to me as we were talking about the actual making, the actual making, the Mayse, and how that it's traced in spirituality.
Tim Ingold has this beautiful book called Making, which is about how human beings create meaning through music and architecture and poetry, but also through physical artistry and craftsmanship. And I think it's a skill that in modern industrialized capitalist society, where it's cheaper to buy something new than to have something repaired in some crazy way, it's something that fewer and fewer of us have access to. But I remember watching a toy repair when I was a kid, putting together a piece of a toy that had broken, and he still had one of those, like, he had the kind of they're not goggles. No, what's the word I'm looking for? Not a microscope. he had a little lens that he could put down to be able to see out of one eye, to be able to put things together that were so small. And I actually had this moment where I remember watching that, and then I remember going to a Target and being like, wow, an endless aisle of plastic junk, and just thinking to myself of what's been lost. Thank you, Eugene. That's a beautiful image. Okay, Evie, thank you so much for your
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you so much, Rabbi Mayse, for sharing your Torah with us again this week. I'm looking forward to next week. Just a reminder to everyone that registration is open to other classes here at Springsman. You can find us at 5784.risha.org/spring. And also, we do have a class starting in less than 20 minutes. Discussions on the parasha, a weekly shiur with a rotation of teachers. Today we have Rabbanit Leah Sarna with us. So I will see you soon in this class as well. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Lehitraot. Bye.